Okay, welcome to Module 6 on intersectionality and microaggressions. And this is our last module in the training course. So let's start with what are microaggressions? So microaggressions are something that make an individual feel uncomfortable, marginalized or small. That might be something about a comment on their appearance. Perhaps it's about how they wear their hair, their role, how they speak, their language skills, or othering them, just an attempt to other them. And if we use the metaphor of a paper cut, a microaggression is a little bit like a paper cut. If you think about a paper cut, really painful, a little tiny cut, but very, very painful. And if you imagine that during the day you got these paper cuts again and again and again, that's what microaggressions are. They are these little tiny cuts that people receive, sometimes on a daily basis, multiple times, that help them feel like they're not part of a community or they're other than the people that are around them. So sometimes microaggressions are intentional, but often they might be unintentional or unconsciously done. And that's why it's so important that we bring these to our awareness and also help others bring it to their awareness too. So have a think about what you can think of in terms of microaggressions. So we had some on the page before. What microaggressions can you think of that might come up in social care? Things that might come up in day-to-day chats, for example. So I can think of thinking about working in care homes, for example, that people whose first language isn't English might be told that they can't be understood, or they might be asked where they're from, even if they've been in the UK for a really, really long time and they see themselves as somebody who is British. So jot down some ideas in your workbook, and then when you're ready, move on to the next slide. So when we think about microaggressions, this quote from the Royal College of Nursing is really helpful to think about the fact that actually micro is refers to the subtle delivery of the aggression, not its impact. So perhaps a person unintentionally speaks about language or someone's hair or the way they dress, but actually the impact is significant. Going back to those paper cuts, if you're experiencing this kind of language or behavior day in, day out, it must become very tiring and emotionally draining. So this video just gives us a little bit more of an example of my types of microaggressions people experience. These are very much based in the microaggression of race, but microaggressions can sit across all protected characteristics, but are more usually felt in areas around race and nationality. This video is from the Royal College of Physiotherapy, but it does apply to all of us when we think about health and social care.
Where are you from, originally?
I get asked this all the time. And after 16 years of living here, I still don't feel I belong.
You try to ignore it, but it can still drag you down. Microaggressions are when we show subtle negative attitudes, discrimination or hostility towards a member of a marginalised group. The thing about microaggressions is, you may not have meant it, but it still makes the other person feel belittled.
Can you let me know who the decision maker is?
I get subtle questions about my authority because I am black.
You may not have noticed it, but it still shatters the other person's confidence.
I can't pronounce your name, it's too difficult.
I say it phonetically, but often they can't be bothered to try.
The scale of the problem is huge, and at the moment, we are only just chipping away at it. We all have a role to play. Call out microaggressions. Educate, challenge, support. Get started at csp.org.uk/microaggressions.
So that just gives a little bit of an overview in terms of kind of microaggressions and how people might experience them, the impact that they have, that kind of confidence shattering, the feeling that you don't belong. And so when we think about microaggressions, we can very much think about becoming more aware of perhaps if we might be um, giving people that kind of using those kind of microaggressions, and how we can start to change the way that we ask questions or step back and really, again, linking back to bias in module 5, think about our unconscious biases, bringing them into the conscious, being more aware of when we might be saying things that might be impacting on someone else. So let's think then, how do we reduce microaggressions, and how, when you're doing your roles, you're out in health and social care, perhaps you're making recommendations for others around their use of microaggressions. How can we reduce them? So first of all, really consider what you're going to ask people in your role before you ask it. So you could perhaps prepare some questions for people, and then check through for any risk of microaggressions, or any questions that might mean someone is being othered when they don't need to be. Particularly, I'm thinking around staff, for example, or residents in a care home, or patients in a hospital. Consider how it might feel if you were on the receiving end of a question. Maybe think about your own heritage and history, any protected characteristics that you might have, and imagine if somebody was doing a microaggression and it was in relation to you. How might it feel if you were on the receiving end? And so, as the video said, names are really important. Ask someone how they pronounce the name and practice it. You can get them to do that phonetic thing and explain for you. It's really important that you get their name right, and someone's going to be really willing to tell you how to do that. Pronouns are really important, particularly for people who are non-binary and trans. And so it's really important that you check with somebody about their pronouns, especially if you're writing about them in a report. Pronouns are things like he, him, she, her, and they, them. And it's important to not just ask people in front of others, because they might be uncomfortable. So ask somebody in private: when I write about you in this report and say that I've spoken to you, how do you want me to refer to you? What are your pronouns? If they don't understand what that means, you can explain to them so that they also become more educated around the use of pronouns too. Another thing to ask is, really, do you need to ask someone's ethnicity? Sometimes we do have to record people's demographics, but if we don't need to, then let's not, because otherwise it's always putting people into a different category perhaps than ours. If you do need to ask their ethnicity, if there's a requirement, perhaps a funding requirement for demographics, then make sure you accept the person's first answer and don't interrogate them, and make sure they know that they can say prefer not to say as well. And if you do get it wrong, apologize. We might not use the right gender, or we might not always pronounce someone's name right, but we can learn and do better. And we can always apologize to someone and tell them that we will try better next time. So, another task for you here. Just thinking about your role and reducing the impact of microaggressions. Have a think about actions that you might be able to take to reduce the impact within the organisations you're visiting of microaggressions. Perhaps in terms of some of the things we suggested on the slide before about being open, apologising, checking names and languages, looking at pronouns, or raising awareness of your own biases and reflecting on them. So really have a look now in your workbooks on what you can do to minimise the likelihood of creating microaggressions. Jot down some ideas, pause the video here, and then when you're ready, move on to the next slide. So we're going to finish off with a little bit about intersectionality and language. So intersectionality isn't a term that's in everyday use, but it is a growing in awareness and usage now. And it's very much around growing in things like policies, procedures and structures. So the term intersectionality has its roots in Black feminist activism and was originally coined by an American woman called Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989. And she used this term when she was referring to the double discrimination that Black women experience of being Black and being a woman, and talking about how sometimes the experience that they have isn't because they're Black, it's not because they're a woman, it's because they're a Black woman, and how that intersectionality of being Black and a woman come together. It started to really gain traction in terms of thinking about intersectionality and how all of these different things that make up our identity can intersect together, particularly around things like protected characteristics such as race, gender identity, disability, sexual orientation, and also, really importantly, things like class and our occupation and how they intersect. So just a word of caution on intersectionality. There are people who feel that intersectionality is a word that should only be coined in the use of discussions around Black women because it was very much centered around Black women in its kind of first usage, and that actually, if it moves more widely into some of the kind of areas that we've got on the screen, then that meaning is going to be diluted and lost. But not everyone feels this way, and it's an important consideration when we think about the people that we have in front of us. What protected characteristics do they have, or what conditions might be making things harder for them? Have you got somebody in front of you who's not only Black but also gay, and somebody who's experiencing mental health and issues and physical health conditions? That's a lot of intersectionality, and we should be considering what that means for the person and not just treating their protected characteristics separately. So one way we can make sure that we are really thinking about getting things right is using inclusive language. Leeds University have come up with a few kind of do's and don'ts that will help you when you're thinking about how to write in your reports, how to speak with people when you visit locations, and how to really generally get more familiar with using inclusive language. So in terms of do's, it's about using language that acknowledges diversity and conveys respect to all people, about proactively including welcoming words, phrases, and expressions. Language that challenges conscious and unconscious biases. So, for example, avoiding masculine pronouns or nouns for mixed gender groups. Using neutral language for gender, for example. About avoiding assumptions that might exclude people. Using language that respects people's privacy to share information about themselves if and when they feel comfortable doing so, and recognizes that the individual lived experiences within groups means that not everybody within the same group will be the same or have the same experience. So, for example, within disability, there will be so many different experiences of discrimination, harassment, microaggressions, and their lived experience will be different depending on who you speak to. Everyone has a different personal lived experience. So not generalizing when you're referring to groups of people or discussing data. And then in terms of don'ts, not using language that reinforces stereotypes or derogatory terms, or anything that patronizes or trivializes groups of people. Anything that excludes certain groups of people. So, for example, assuming that the white population is the norm. Anything that could cause discomfort or offence, and anything that groups together all people within a certain category. So using terms, for example, like the disabled, the Muslims, the single mothers, or BAME communities. If you're not sure when you're writing a report whether the language that you're using is inclusive and appropriate, then get it checked with somebody else. Ask a manager, ask a friend, a colleague, someone who is allowed to look at that report and can tell you, perhaps this needs to be tweaked, or yeah, that's good inclusive language. It's always important to make sure that you are trying as much as possible to use inclusive language and to not exclude particular groups of people. And then I just want to end this module really with thinking about the trauma that sometimes being different can bring. So we should be celebrating difference. Being different should be something that we see as a positive thing that we can celebrate because it brings so much to our workplaces, our social groups, the places that we frequent, groups and activities and daily life. However, so many people who have protected characteristics suffer discrimination. They suffer violence, oppression, and fear for being different. And particularly for those who have visible differences, such as race, ethnicity, religion, or a visible disability, the discrimination has likely been there for their whole life, and this may have caused trauma. And so you can be trauma informed when you're working with people who might have protected characteristics. And in terms of being trauma informed, some key things really are being aware that being different to the norm can cause trauma in the first place. If you're working with somebody, you're meeting them and you're talking about their experiences, just being aware that actually by being Black, for example, and being different to the norm, they might have experienced trauma because of the colour of their skin. Being aware of your biases and taking a step back when you're working with others. So really slowing down decision making, slowing down communication, stopping and reflecting when people are sharing with you or before you ask them to share something. And always being curious about someone's experience and aiming to be inclusive in your practice. Again, if you're not sure how to do this, speaking to a manager or a colleague who can talk through their own ideas with you and you can work together and share experiences. Always ask people the language that they use to describe themselves. So we've talked about things like pronouns and making sure that we don't ask about ethnicity unless it's absolutely necessary. Asking people how they describe themselves in terms of their protected characteristics if they need to. Ask people what they're prepared to talk about and what their boundaries are. Put them in control as much as possible, even if it's your interview, giving them the kind of right to put the boundaries around what they will talk about, what they want to have in the interview, where they want to do it, even. And only ask them for information you need for the work. So don't get people to repeat their life stories when they don't need to, even if it seems like something you'd be really interested in. So that's it. We've finished module 6 and now it's time for the knowledge check. So you'll find the link to the form in your workbook. Please confirm what on the knowledge check that you've undertaken all the training and complete the questions, which will then be checked by a member of the team. Thanks so much for the involvement and participation that you've given this training, and I will wish you luck in your roles as you go out and do them. Bye for now.